My guest today is Angela Watson. Angela is an assistant professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Education and the creator of the new Homeschool Hub at the Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy. The Homeschool Hub provides in-depth data on homeschooling, various homeschooling regulations, and research all across the U.S. Angela Watson, welcome to the Liberated Podcast.
Hi, Carrie. It's good to see you today. Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you here. I am just so excited about the Homeschool Hub. I know this has been in the works for a while. You've been crunching the data for many months, and the Homeschool Hub just launched officially earlier this year. So I'd love to just start, maybe if we could, Angela, with your background in research into homeschooling, because you've been covering homeschooling and trying to gather what data was available around homeschooling for a number of years, publishing research papers around homeschooling. So what got you interested in homeschooling to begin with?
Yeah, thanks. So when I started graduate school, I went back to school as a non-traditional student with two small toddlers to get my, I went all the way through to did my bachelor's and master's and PhD, boom, boom, boom. And so when I was doing my PhD in education policy, I got interested. We did a lot on school choice, education reform, and I got interested in homeschooling. It's something that I had always kind of aspired to do with my own family, but just never took the plunge. But I knew folks who homeschooled, and very few people were researching it. And so I thought it was just an interesting topic. And I kind of did lots of other things, but I always kind of worked on the homeschooling kind of on the back burner, kind of as a passion project in the background. And like you said, I collected data. So probably almost for the last decade, I've been collecting and storing the data and using it along the way. It turns out that's a good thing because a lot of these states have purged their data. And so we have it, because people like me and others have stockpiled it. And, we can look back to what things were, what the trends looked like from 10 years, 20 years ago. So that's
Wow.
interesting. So anyway, it was kind of a side project for me that I like to kind of keep my finger in. But COVID happened, and everybody was schooling from home to some degree or other. And suddenly I became really popular because there weren't very many people researching homeschooling, and people were turning to me then for homeschooling information and also learning pods, right? Remember the learning pods. And so I did a couple publications on learning pods, and I started, amping up my work a little bit into homeschooling. And of course, post pandemic, now we know that homeschooling has grown and we need a lot more information. So yeah, it's kind of how it all began.
So fascinating. So tell us a little bit more about the data. I mean, I think one of the really tricky things that you likely saw as a researcher is just the fact that homeschooling is a sort of a state by state issue, and some states collect data on homeschoolers or collect robust data, other states don't. There's different reporting requirements and even requirements to even indicate that you're homeschooling in various states. So what did you discover in trying to collect meaningful data across the country? What were some of the disparities there?
I knew from my prior work that homeschooling was regulated at the state. Every state was different. Finding the data for particular states was onerous. It was an onerous task, and you have to go state by state. Every website's different. They call it different names, but I don't think that I fully recognized the depth of the variation between the states till we started creating the hub, and we did a state by state catalog. We created kind of a worksheet, and we would go through the worksheet and, check the boxes and fill in the blanks. And it was really difficult because, states don't call it homeschooling in every state. And even in most states, it's homeschooling, or it's non-public schooling, or it's non-accredited private schooling. I mean, they have all of these different names, and that's not even counting all of these new models that are spinning off, like hybrids and co-ops and micro schools, right? And so just trying to catalog all of that information and come up with like some sort of common denominator was really, really difficult. The variation too in like what types of services kids can access if they're a homeschooler in one state versus another The spread in compulsory ages for students is huge across the country. We can't even agree on what years students need to be educated, right? So some states are from 5 years old to 18, some are from 10 to 16. Like, it's really crazy, the variation in a lot of these different things across the United States.
Just amazing. So how did you wade through some of that? I think about a state like California where homeschooling is relatively easy and does sort of fall under that non-public school or / private school reporting process. So how do you decipher what we would think of as traditional private schools and what are these single family homeschoolers?
Right. So California, we don't have any information on California that comes directly from the state. So the state collects information, and they're not the only one. There are a few states, I think there are half a dozen or so states that collect information on homeschoolers, but then don't publicly report it. California is one of them. We do have some information on California on the hub that comes from what the Washington Post collected. And so, I'm not exactly sure how they collected that. I think they had to go zip code by zip code, district by district to get that information. But the bottom line is, some states provide the information, they collect it and provide it. Some collect it but don't provide it, and some don't collect it at all. And in between all of that, there's a fair amount of incorrect reporting, and we just don't know. They're extremely difficult to count. Georgia's a really good example. In Georgia, you have to graduate high school from an accredited high school. And so homeschoolers will be classified legally as homeschoolers until their kids are maybe in 9th and 10th grade. And then parents may choose to become private schoolers. They're still doing the exact same thing, but they are now private schoolers in an umbrella private school that is accredited. So then their student can graduate from an accredited high school and qualify for the college scholarship. And so, the counting there is tricky because that student suddenly fell out of our numbers of homeschoolers, right, when they turned 9th or 10th grade, but they were still actually doing the same thing. We see this a lot too with microschoolers, and how microschoolers are counted. And so it's important to kind of understand that there are some distinctions. Everyone that's counted as a homeschooler is not necessarily sitting at their kitchen table with their parent and siblings. It's very likely that they are involved in a hybrid school or a micro school or some of these other things that look more like traditional school setups, but are legally classified as homeschooling.
Yeah. Do you have any sense of what those numbers might be or any plans to sort of think about that further? Because, I think about a lot of these micro schools or hybrid homeschool programs. Students are kind of legally recognized as homeschoolers, but they could be attending these programs 5 days a week as a low cost, full-time schooling alternative. While again being legally homeschooler. So do you have any speculation around numbers there or percentages, roughly speaking?
It's going to be really difficult. No, we don't. And it's going to be really difficult to count. We're getting ready to do a survey, a nationally representative survey, where we're going to ask some of those questions. So we'll be able to get some sort of hint. How many are homeschooling? How many are microschooling? How many are in a hybrid? And then we define those things because parents call them all different kinds of things. And so, we can get some sort of ref number from there. The other thing that's been really interesting that's happening is all of the new ESAs that are coming on. So Alabama just passed an ESA this week, and I was reading the legislation, but they don't include microschoolers.
Right.
And so what they're doing is incentivizing people who are microschoolers don't qualify for any of the funding. So then they will classify as homeschoolers so that they can get some of the partial funding that's going to come to homeschoolers, right? And so, we have all these weird things going on in the states, especially around these ESAs. But I do think there is some potential for states that have ESAs for us to see how many homeschoolers are using those funds and what mode of schooling they're doing. Now, Alabama is not an example of that because of the way the law was written. They're kind of putting those people together in one bucket. But we are kind of talking about states where we might be able to see, at least with the public fund people, how many are homeschoolers, how many are microschoolers, what kind of education, and even what kind of curriculum they're using, some of that type of thing. Finding out more.
So you mentioned a bit earlier, Angela, about the Washington Post. They came out with an extensive analysis of homeschooling back in the fall of 2023. And how does their data compare to yours? What were sort of their data sets? Was there some overlap there? And what were some of the similarities or differences in their findings compared to the Homeschool Hub's data?
Yeah. So it's really interesting. There is a ton of overlap. The Washington Post data only goes back to 2017, I believe, is as far back as they go. We go all the way back to 2000. We have data prior to that. We just made a decision to cut at 2000 and move forward from there. So we have a lot more data across a longer period of time. We also have disaggregated data, and we break it down several different ways when we're able to. So some states will report data by county, grade level, gender. One state even reports by race. And so we have all of that available on the Homeschool Hub in our data. Washington Post doesn't have any of that. So they have overall counts of homeschoolers by state. And then it is really cool. You can type in your zip code and get kind of an estimate of how many people homeschool in your particular area of interest. What is interesting, though, is that when we collected our data for the Hub directly from the state websites, the Washington Post collected their data in a different way, and they collected it and they report it at the county or the district level. When we compared our state totals to their state totals, they were different. And oftentimes the Washington Post number was higher, and sometimes significantly, like tens of thousands of students higher. What I think, so there's, a couple things that could have happened. They're wrong, right? I mean, that's possible. Or the state's wrong. That's also possible. Or, I kind of wonder if the state is reporting lower numbers and the Washington Post couldn't reconcile their numbers with what the state is reporting because they had to roll it up at every county or district level. And so they couldn't, massage the numbers. So there's clearly something going on. It wasn't in every state. It was, in 6 or 8 states, but there were some pretty significant discrepancies. So, it's interesting to think about, why states might do that, how that might be happening as far as, some policy issues there.
Yeah, so let's dig into the data a little bit. Angela, what are you finding in terms of overall numbers of homeschoolers nationwide, and how has that number changed kind of pre-pandemic and post-pandemic?
Right. So large increases pre to mid, and even post-pandemic. So prior to the pandemic, there were around, 2% of the US K-12 population participating in homeschooling. Post-pandemic, the federal estimate is 4.5%. We think that it's higher than that. So we're saying somewhere between 5 to 6%, because there are lots of reasons that people that are homeschooling wouldn't report. Like we've talked about, people are homeschooling, but they're classified as private schoolers. There's no reason that I can think of that people would legally classify themselves as homeschoolers when they were actually in a public school, right? But that's unlikely to happen. But it could happen the other direction. So we think it's higher. It's also important to two things. For context, when I say that homeschoolers represent 5 to 6%, that seems small, overall. In the grand scheme of things. So it's important to understand 9% of students in the United States attend private schools. 7% attend charter schools. We hear about that all the time. Millions and millions and millions of dollars are pumped into researching those sectors. 5 to 6% are participating in homeschooling. Add to that is a single point in time estimate. That means that today, 5 to 6% of students are homeschooling. What we know, one of the common stereotypes of homeschoolers is that, oh, these homeschool families, they homeschool all their kids always. That's what everyone thinks. And it's just simply not true. People move in and out of homeschooling all the time. Families move in and out of it. Family or students within a family will move in and out of it. Albert Chang is working on some data from a nationally representative survey, and he shows that 40% of people who said they were ever homeschooled were only homeschooled for 1 or 2 years, or 1 to 3, I think. And so that means that the other 10 years of their academic career was somewhere else in some other sector. So we're talking about huge numbers of families who are currently homeschooling, or who have children that have ever been homeschooled, or who will homeschool. So these are pretty giant numbers. Sorry. So post-pandemic, then everyone said, oh, but the numbers will regulate. They'll go back down to what we saw before once the pandemic recedes. Well, they did a little, but they haven't completely, by any means, completely receded to what they were pre-pandemic. We still have huge amounts of homeschoolers in the United States, and we have 8 states where homeschooling continues to grow post-pandemic. So, most states dropped off a little bit, some dropped off a lot, but most states dropped off a little bit, but, still higher than before the pandemic. But 8 states continue to grow. So it's a really interesting and understudied sector.
Just amazing. I heard you mention too, Angela, that the younger generations of parents, kind of Gen Z or younger millennial parents, are more comfortable pursuing homeschooling and other sorts of alternative education, partly because they're just more comfortable with personalized everything in their lives, personalized technology and everything else around them, but partly because, as you've said in the past, homeschooling has become more normalized for them. And I wonder if part of that is what your data is showing, that there are just these huge amounts of families and individuals who kind of come in and out of homeschooling throughout their K-12 experience. Is that what you think is probably happening?
Yeah, it's interesting. We don't know about the younger parents necessarily. What we do know is that in the data where we can see stratification by age or grade, the growth during the pandemic was primarily in younger grades, right? So first, second, third grade. That's where the bulk of the growth was, like 70%. Most of the growth wasn't happening in high school grades. And so this is kind of anecdotal, like we haven't dug into it deeply, but we've seen this in several states, and people have reported this, in the homeschool literature. There are 2 things that could be happening there. Parents of younger students didn't want their kids sitting in classrooms with masks or whatever. I don't know, there's some reason maybe that parents of younger children chose to homeschool them. But it's also possible that younger students have younger parents, and then you get into that generational thing where it's possible that these younger parents, for them, homeschooling wasn't stigmatized in the same way maybe that it was stigmatized for my generation. They've grown up with it. Their neighbor was homeschooled. It's nothing special to them, and so they were more willing maybe to give it a go. So that's something definitely that we need to dig into, and we don't really know. We don't really know why. So again, needs to be studied.
Yeah. And do you agree with the Washington Post assessment that homeschooling is the fastest growing form of education in the US?
I mean, I haven't really looked at it in those terms compared to the other sectors. I mean, clearly it is growing, while we have, pretty enormous and concerning declines in enrollment in the public and in some cases the private sector, right? So if the others are receding and homeschooling is growing, then yeah, it probably is, the fastest growing sector right now.
So, Angela, tell us a little bit about the demographics of today's homeschooling parents. We talked about sort of stereotypes and how homeschooling might have been stigmatized in previous generations. And now, what does homeschooling look like?
Right. So we know during the pandemic and even prior to the pandemic, so prior to the pandemic, homeschooling was growing, but it was very slow. So overall, but within that overall growth, Black and brown homeschoolers were growing at a higher rate than white homeschoolers. So pre-pandemic, but it was again pretty slow, incremental growth. We knew that they were growing. During the pandemic, the Black and brown homeschooling really increased. And so we know that homeschooling, even post-pandemic, is more diverse than it was pre-pandemic. Again, these ESAs and the opportunity for some of these public monies may push people who were on the threshold of wanting to homeschool but couldn't figure out how to do it. This extra funding might help them cross over that barrier. And you also have, I work from home. Lots of people work from home or have hybrid setups. It really changes the idea of, you have to be a 2-parent household in order to homeschool, right? Or one parent has to give up their income in order to homeschool. Like all of those things are super limiting as to who can access homeschooling if that's the case. And I think we're kind of coming out of, if that was ever true, we're kind of coming out of those being barriers to homeschooling. So things are going to become more diverse for those reasons.
And is
But
that because of microschooling and these alternative models, or what do you think?
and so the microschooling is really an interesting thing. I've been concerned about, some of this new legislation and the old legislation. So I've been working in Missouri. Missouri has a tiny ESA that is only available to students in certain areas and of the state. So like high concentration urban areas, minority students, high poverty areas, right? And the variety of issues with both the public and private school settings in those areas, I thought, the thing to do would be to have some little micro schools. The parents want to homeschool, but they can't, they don't know how, they, feel like they don't have the capacity. Thought, a micro school would be perfect in these areas. A few moms or grandmas, grandparents could get together and, come up with something, or they could hire a teacher, but these ESAs required, so the new Alabama law also that just was passed this week, they tend to require that any private school that's receiving the funding be accredited. And this is a huge stumbling block. So it seems like a super common sense thing that accreditation is going to guarantee some sort of, rigor of education, quality of education. The problem is that accreditation takes years to achieve, multiple years, and it's like $15,000. And so a tiny startup school can't be accredited. And the way that the system is set up right now could never be accredited. And so the system or the policies are privileging established, high enrollment established schools for these ESAs, but they don't exist in the places where they're needed, where this needs to be happening, right? So you've got kind of these problems where it's a chicken and an egg issue. I would like to see some of these ESAs open up to give a little bit more room, or kind of a sliding scale on accreditation for some of these micro schools to start up. And again, instead of letting them be private schools and micro schools, you're forcing these parents who are doing this thing anyway to legally be classified as homeschoolers. They get a tiny fraction of what the funding would be if they were in a private school. And, there are a lot of other issues that people are concerned about, isolation or whatever of kids. These micro schools are a good a medium solution to that, where they can be with other families, they can be in a more diverse setting with other students, et cetera, et cetera. And we're really blocking that for them. So it's a really interesting policy, fluctuations right now.
Really fascinating. So, Angela, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the most recent federal data from the Household Pulse survey was from 2016 on homeschoolers. And that data showed that the number one reason that families chose homeschooling was concern about the environment of other schools, including safety, drugs, and negative peer pressure. Do you have any updated data on that from the Homeschool Hub or are expecting any? I guess what is motivating today's families?
Yeah. So safety is a huge issue. It has always been an issue, but it has risen to the number one issue. So that's another stereotype. People think that homeschool for some sort of religious reasons. It's not. It's homeschoolers, their primary concern is safety. Now, safety could mean different things to different people, but whatever
Mm.
the case, that is their primary concern. But to the pulse, there have been new pulse surveys come out that catalog some homeschooling things. We're working with that data right now, and hope to have a new page up on the hub that looks at some of the pulse things, particularly characteristics of families who homeschool and what actual homeschoolers really and truly do look like. That will show kind of some of their diversity, which we're pretty excited about that. And, I don't know, I'm trying to think if the new pulse surveys, they've changed it a little bit. And if the new pulse surveys talk about reasons for homeschooling or reasons for whatever, mode of education they're involved in. And I can't remember if that's the case, but yes, the older data we have, does indeed say that safety is a main concern.
Yeah, and did you see in your data going back to 2000 sort of trends that you could spot? Like, did families maybe choose homeschooling originally for more, religious or faith-based reasons, and then gradually it moved towards safety and sort of school environment? Or I guess what did you see over time, or did you?
Yeah, I think that, the academic quality is one as well. And so there have been
Mm.
shifts. There have been shifts over time. Um, Religion was closer to the top. I think now it's number 5 or number 6. Like it's not that high. Academic quality is a concern. And then the safety has been the number one concern. I think even pre-pandemic, that was a major concern. Um, you know,
Yeah. Yeah. And you said that you're seeing a lot of growth among Black and Brown homeschooling families that have started pre-pandemic and has persisted today. What are some of your theories of what is driving the population of Black and Brown families to choose homeschooling today?
So I've talked to a few leaders in the homeschooling community, in the Black and the Brown communities. And so there are some important things. First of all, both the Black community of homeschoolers and the Brown community of homeschoolers are separate. So oftentimes when we talk about groups, we lump
Mm.
Black and Brown in together, right? And they have different motivations, they have different concerns, and they don't want to be lumped in together.
Hmm.
um, some similarities that I see in talking to them: culture and culturally relevant instruction is a big thing for them. So in the Black community, the history of low expectations, they feel that their children aren't being taught well, that there aren't high expectations, that they think they can do better at home. And the cultural issue, they want, you know, their kids maybe are exposed to only white teachers in the traditional public school. They would like them to have some Black teachers, some Black role models, more Black history. All of these kind of things are concerns. For the Brown families, similar concerns, but also they're really interested in the cultural relevancy from like an Spanish speaking lens, right? They want more than just a week or a month a year on their culture. They want their culture every day. They want their kids to be able to speak to their grandparents who speak Spanish. And so these are important values for them, and they are not being met in the schools. In fact, many states have laws against bilingual instruction in the public schools. That instruction has to come in English. And so this is something that they feel really strongly about. Both Black and Brown communities, also the sense of community, having a sense of community in their smaller communities is really important to them. And they feel like that is not fostered in their traditional public schools, or in private schools in the same way that they can do for themselves at home. Another interesting thing that I was talking to one of the leaders about, she was telling me that their sense is more that maybe white families are pulled to homeschooling. We have lots of choices, we have lots of resources, we can choose what we want. Whereas the Black families feel pushed out, right? So this push and pull dynamic is different depending on where you're coming to homeschooling from. So instead of homeschooling being your first choice, homeschooling might be your last resort. And I don't mean that to like disparage homeschooling or make it sound like it was your last choice, but in some circumstances, these families turn to it because they have nowhere else to turn. So the whole dynamic around why they're homeschooling, I think, can be really different depending on where you're coming to it from.
And Angela, haven't you also talked about network effects within the Black and Brown community also contributing to some of the growth there? I wonder if you could explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, and so it's interesting to think about how people figure out how to do homeschooling, because there was nobody teaching people how to do this, right? Especially 20 years ago before the internet. Like now you could probably go to the internet and find a resource and it will give you the basics, like how do I homeschool? And it will give you some basic resources and places where you can get plugged in and kind of start to learn. But prior to that, there weren't really, you know, there was no course that you could take on homeschooling. Then nobody wrote a book about, how to homeschool. And so people really did it grassroots, where you learned from your neighbor, you learned from your friend group or your church group or whatever that looked like. And so understanding for emerging communities that are now coming to homeschooling in larger numbers, how that's working for them, and, their own grassroots, um, networks where they're kind of teaching each other how to do it. And the needs maybe are different in different communities and how they're kind of figuring that out. Also, some of these minoritized communities feel more threatened. And so it's more secretive and they kind of don't, they also feel excluded in many of the white homeschool groups. So white homeschoolers have Facebook groups or whatever. They either feel somewhat unwelcome in some of those groups, or it just isn't speaking to their particular needs because we have different needs maybe. So yeah, it's really interesting kind of looking at that. And like I said, I've talked to a couple of leaders in these communities, and literally like there are only a couple. And so it's something that's really emerging, where they're really starting to build their own networks and connect with each other and become really policy savvy, sharing that knowledge with each other. It's really interesting to see.
So great. I'm just so thrilled that you're collecting this data and that you're analyzing it and doing additional research. What are some of your speculation, prediction of the future of homeschooling? Where do you think this is going?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. Clearly growing. I think it's going to continue to grow. But I think people are going to continue to innovate, and I think it's going to continue to morph into different things. I don't know if in 10 years we'll still call it homeschooling. I don't know if even in a couple of years this will still be called. There will be people homeschooling, but we have to come up with some way to I measure things and I like to put things in a bucket. And so we have to come up with some sort of bucket that accounts for all of these different models, because it's getting too complicated. 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, if I said homeschooling to you, you knew exactly what I meant. There were only three choices. You were private schooled, you were public schooled, or you were homeschooled. That was it. And so nowadays, that's not the case anymore. We have people doing all kinds of things. They call it all different kinds of names. And it's becoming very confusing and difficult to measure. And so we're either going to have to forget trying to, name all the things, or we're going to have to come up with some sort of bigger bucket. But I definitely think it's growing, especially as these new ESAs come in. More and more people are going to be trying out some different options. We're going to see a lot of changes, I think.
But like you mentioned, Angela, some of the ESAs could actually manipulate the data by pushing homeschoolers into maybe a private school just to be able to qualify, for a certain ESA program. So that will be interesting to watch and
Right.
see some of those changes there.
Right.
So What is the best way for my listeners and viewers to, I guess, do two things? First, access the Homeschool Hub at Johns Hopkins University and also use it. What would be helpful to them? What will they find there that would be valuable?
So the Homeschool Hub really is just a catalog of all information on homeschooling for all 50 states. So policy, regulation, the history, and then we have all of the data. So if you go, you can Google Hopkins Homeschool Hub, and it should pop up. On there, we have a button that says download the data. And if you click on that, you can see the data and then you can choose to download it. But all of the data for all of the states is in there. Towards the end of the file are all of the disaggregated data. So all of that is available for researchers or policy folks. Also, policy folks can get on there. I've had lots of different states contacting me asking, what is the best language? What do you think of this or that? You can get on the hub and link to the legislative language for Vermont versus Kentucky versus New York and compare. So those are things where we have just really taken all of this information and put it together in one place to streamline anybody's interest in homeschooling, particularly around participation and regulation is all there together in one place. And then we're working on phase 2 now where we're going to be expanding. We're going to be adding some special topics. We just added one about the intersection of homeschooling and GT, or gifted and talented students. We're looking into access for SPED students or students with IEPs or special needs. We're going to be adding a page on Black homeschoolers and brown homeschoolers. So we've got a lot in the works right now where we're going to be looking at some of these special topics as well as just the basic catalog.
Well, what an incredible resource. And I imagine, kind of looking back in your early days of researching homeschooling, I imagine you didn't expect it to be this dynamic.
Right.
And hopefully it's been rewarding and exciting for you, kind of digging into this data and seeing where it goes.
Yeah.
Uh, Angela, I wonder what is the best way for my listeners and viewers to follow your work and learn more about your research?
So in part with the Homeschool Hub, we have a research lab. So on the Hub, there's a research lab page. We're doing a lot of research. They can follow there. We're going to have a newsletter starting in April, coming out quarterly, where folks can kind of sign up for the newsletter. And then I'm on Twitter. You can, Angela R. Watson, you can check me out on Twitter if you want to as well.
Wonderful. I'll put a link to the hub and a link to your Twitter in the show notes. And Angela Watson, best wishes to you. Thank you for this lovely resource. And thanks for being on the Liberated podcast.
Thank you, Carrie. It was a pleasure.